Welcome to this week's lecture, in which I will talk about invention of photography, and I will also introduce two first photographic processes, Daguerreotype and Calotype. Before we do that, I just want to briefly review what we talked about last week in class. We discussed idealized versus realistic view of the world, and we explained how there was a dramatic change in the Renaissance time. View of the world changed dramatically from religious to secular, and world is no longer just a prelude to eternal life. An artist embraced to optical tools, which were camera obscura and camera lucida, as drawing aids to help them draw realistic perspectives. Before Renaissance time, camera obscura existed, but there was lack of desire for realistic representation of perspective. So the question is, why didn't photography develop sooner? And we're going to talk about three factors that actually resulted in invention of photography. The first one was desire for realism that existed for hundreds of years before invention of photography. The second one was development of technology, and the final one was development of science. Now, let's talk about technical innovations as the second factor that resulted in invention of photography. Now, technical innovations were camera obscura and how it developed from a room-sized device to a portable device with a mirror and a lens, mirror that turned an image right side up that originally was upside down. Now we know from the camera obscura that images were upside down. However, with this mirror mechanism that exists in today's cameras as well, that image was turned right side up. Now we see here camera obscura as a room size, and we see a smaller portable camera obscura that artists were able to take outside and actually draw realistic perspective using it. And then we also had camera lucida as another drawing aid. Now, both of these devices were used as drawing aids to render the world more realistically. Finally, the last of the factors that developed was the development of science. Now, what scientists were trying to find for a long time is a chemical compound that would react to light, meaning that would change a tone or color when reacting to light. Here, I'm going to show you two separate timelines. One was Johann Schultz, who is a German scientist, and he discovered that salts of silver, particularly silver nitrate, darken when exposed to light. Now, everybody who had done darkroom photography may have seen hands like that because that silver nitrate still exists in darkroom or film photography today. And when it reacts to light, it turns black. Now, one of the things that he did, he would place different kind of silver salts diluted in water and put them in a jar, and then he would see how that silver salt solution would react to light. He found out that if he put silver nitrate in a jar and put a label on top of that jar, that the liquid would darken when exposed to light. And the one that was covered with the label, the one that was not exposed to light, would actually stay clear. So he found out that that's the salt that reacts to light. He didn't really know what to do with it, but that was just the discovery of a salt that darkens in contact with light. Now, on the other hand, a different timeline, we have a British potter, Thomas Wedgwood, and his partner, chemist. They were trying to find a way to reproduce drawing on china. So they also used silver chloride or silver nitrate, meaning the same salt that Johann Schultz used, in order to translate the drawings and the images that they have repeatedly on china, right? So the pattern would be the same from one china to the other. However, the images that they made deteriorated really fast, meaning they would turn black. And if the china was shown under a strong light, the images would just turn black. So they didn't know how to fix that image. So now in this world in which we have this long-lasting desire for capturing realistic images, we have technology, meaning we have a camera obscura, which is now a portable size. And we also have science that allowed us to find chemical compounds that react to light. Now, in this world, we have French inventor Joseph Nicephore Niepce, who between 1822 and 1827 experimented with making pictures using something that is called bitumen of Judea. Now, what bitumen of Judea was a asphalt-coated metal or glass plate. And what he would do is something that is called heliographs. And at that time, a lot of the things were being named after a Greek name. And helios in Greek means the sun. So heliograph in translation would be drawing with sun or drawing with light. So what he would do, he would place object on top of this asphalt-coated metal or glass plate, expose them to light. Now, part of that plate that was exposed to light would harden. The one that was below the object would stay soft. And then he would use the solvent, which was a kerosene-like material, to wash away the asphalt that wasn't exposed to light and leaving the hardened or black asphalt behind. And these are some of the images in which the objects were placed on top of this asphalt-coated plate to make heliographs. And then he came to a conclusion, why wouldn't I just put that asphalt-coated metal plate in one of the camera obscuras? And he did so. He put asphalt-coated metal plate in the back of the camera obscura. And what we have here, after an 8-hour exposure, something that is generally known as the first photograph. You will see that sometimes it says that it's made in 1827, sometimes in 1826, but it was around that time. It was called View from the Window at Le Gras, which is Niepce's studio in France. And there are obvious problems with this photograph here. Again, considered to be the first photograph. Clearly, the resolution is not that great. It is very hard to see what is happening here. We see the roofs, we see the walls. But also because the exposure was so long, the highlights in that scene would change in a very realistic way. So we can see that the highlights are here on this side, but also highlights are here as well, as the sun would move across the sky for the duration of an 8-hour exposure. Now, this is how the original photograph looks like today. It's being held in Austin, in a museum there. This is the actual image. And you can see how poor the quality was. What you've seen 2 slides before is the enhanced image, and this is the original plate. The image was very faint, and even at that time, it was not considered to be a spectacular image. However, it opened a door to something that could be potentially spectacular, right? So we have now this asphalt-coated plate put into camera obscura, very long exposure, and washed out in solvent. And then we have this faint image of the reality of the world that was in front of camera obscura. At the same time, we have Daguerre, who was a French businessman. He was owner of Diorama Theater, which opened in 1822, pretty much the same time when Niepce started to experiment with his bitumen of Judea or his heliographs. What he would do, he would paint huge daily scenes on a theatrical screen. They were 60 by 80 foot big, and he would play them in front of the audience. Now, diorama was a theater that manipulated light through that theatrical screen to create the illusion of passing time, for example, from day to night, and then the audience would come in and they would observe it. Now, let me just show you what it looked like. So this was a representation of the diorama theater in which we have this theatrical screen with a scene. There would be people behind it. The orchestra would play. They would make sounds. They would follow the way the scene would change, for example, from day to night. The audience would observe something that would have lasted for maybe 12, 13, 14, 20 hours, compressed into maybe a half hour or an hour long scene. Now, for us, it just doesn't seem overly exciting, but for people then, it was kind of a way of going into a movie theater and see one scene change, pretty realistic change from day to night. Because the audience is pretty much the same as today. You don't want to go to a movie theater and see the same movie twice or 3 times. So the audience was constantly demanding new images or new scenes so they can go into the diorama theater and watch a new scene. However, these theatrical screens were hand painted, and it just took a long time for that scene to change. And because Daguerre, his primary goal was to make money, he wanted to make a faster way of making these theatrical screens. So he heard of Niepce's experiment, and he wanted to meet with him and collaborate with him in order to make these scenes faster. So in 1829, Daguerre and Niepce formed partnership. Obviously, Niepce was the one who was willing to experiment, and Daguerre was the one with money to support him. So with Daguerre's financial support, Niepce was able to refine the process. So now he started using copper sheet coated with silver. That silver-coated copper plate is fumed over heated iodine to form light-sensitive silver iodine. Now, that light-sensitive plate was exposed in camera obscura, and then that exposed plate is fumed over mercury vapors to develop an image. And in time, that 8-hour exposure that we've seen from 1827 and the first image made, 8-hour exposure was shortened to a 20 to 30-minute exposure, and finally 5 to 6. Now, the partnership was really developing well until Niepce died in 1833. Now, I want to show you some of the images done before actual announcement of photography or announcement of the daguerreotype. Now, because of the exposure times were measured in minutes and they were really long, only photographs of still objects, landscapes, and very still portraits could have been taken. Now, this image made in 1838 was considered to be a first known photograph of a person. Now you're thinking, where is the person here? Well, here it is, right here in the corner. And I'm gonna have a little closer look there. Now, what happened there, it's not that this guy was the only one on the street. It was a pretty busy street. However, it was a 5 or 6 minute long exposure, and everything that was moving is just blurred. Motion of a moving object was blurred. So I'm sure there were people on horses, people walking on the sidewalk. However, they were not captured on this plate because they didn't stand still. This guy had his shoe shined, and he was standing still for the duration of the exposure, and that's why we can see him. And finally, January 7th, 1839, Daguerre announces the invention of the daguerreotype process to the French Academy of Sciences. And now the daguerreotype is a silver-coated metal plate fumed with iodine, exposed in camera obscura, and developed in mercury vapors. It was extremely sharp. It was beautifully crisp and sharp image, extremely detailed. However, the problem was that it was not reproducible. So we put one plate in the back of the camera obscura, we expose it, and that's the only image that we have. We cannot make copies of that one. So there were good sides because finally we have this realistic image, but there were also bad sides because it was only one of a kind. Now, I'm interested, what do you think, how did people react to these first photographs? Now, we have something immediately after the invention of photography or announcement of the daguerreotype. We have something which is called the daguerreotype mania, because now photography fed this need and desire for realistic images that was boiling for hundreds of years before that. Now, for the first time, and I want you guys to imagine the world in which you haven't seen image of anyone or anything. The only thing that you've seen is a painting or a drawing. However, it's not a realistic representation. It is the first time that finally in front of them, people have photographs that look so incredibly real that it's hard for them to grasp that this is actually not the real thing. So for the first time, people can examine themselves and others in a still image. And it doesn't really matter if in comparison to today's exposures, those exposures were still too long, 10 minute, 10-second, whatever it is, it was still much faster and cheaper than having their portraits painted. Because that was the only way in which portraits and images could have been done. Either you paint them or you draw them, which takes skill and takes time. And again, it's not realistic. Now, regardless of high prices, the daguerreotype quickly spread around the globe. And within months from the announcements, the instructions were translated in dozens of languages. And the daguerreotype, what was exciting about that? It was an exact replica of that reality. It was not painter's rendition or painter's representation of it. It was exactly the same as the reality in front of camera obscura. Now, if you guys look at the daguerreotypes at that time, people look pretty stiff. Now, one thing that was happening behind the scene, for example, this photograph here, behind the scene or behind them, there was a little clamp in which the head was placed, so the head would be still. Otherwise, it would be motion blurred, right? Because the exposure was still long, 5 to 6 minute long exposure. So try to hold still for 5 to 6 minutes in order to pose for an image. It was pretty hard. So I would argue that the process was stiff, not people were stiff at that time. Now, try to actually hold this pose for some time and try to look happy in the image. It is extremely hard. So a lot of the people in the images looks very serious, very stiff. But if you think about it, the process was very stiff. The process was very slow. And I'm sure that these guys who are we observing now in the images, they would just go out in a bar and have fun, right? So there would be just regular people like us. However, in the images, they look ridiculously stiff. And I'm going to read a couple of quotes for you so you understand a little bit more how hard it was to get an image right. One person who is naturally ugly and finding herself even uglier in the doleful expression of the daguerreotype insists that it is a failure and goes out without taking it. After him, there comes a man with a tic who constantly twitches the corner of his mouth and in spite of it wants to be the daguerreotype. Then another who blinks his eyes rapidly, then an old lady who everlastingly shakes her head. All these people cannot understand that they will never have a successful portrait made by this process. And again, it was a long exposure. You were required to be very still for the duration of that exposure, otherwise you will be blurred. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of daguerreotypes. This is Honore de Balzac, who is a famous French author. This is Isaac Jefferson from 1847, one of the earliest known photographs of an American slave. And this is one of many daguerreotypes made in that time. And you can see how incredibly crisp they are. You can see that people were dressed up really well because it was an event to go and have your image taken. It was not something that you would do on a fly like we are doing now and have gazillion photographs taken in a day. It was an event. It was expensive, and you want to make sure that you look the best you can. But it is just a beautiful, beautiful portrait of these five ladies. So we had the daguerreotype. We have Niepce and Daguerre in France developing their process called Daguerreotype, which again was a one-of-a-kind, extremely sharp image. At the same time, we have William Henry Fox Talbot in England experimenting with light-sensitive chemicals. So that was happening at the same time. Talbot didn't know about Daguerre, Daguerre didn't know about Talbot. So both of these guys developed their own processes simultaneously. He was not commercially driven. He was born with money and he wanted to find a way to use camera obscura to capture images during his travels. So he was committed to find a way to fix an image on paper, unlike Daguerre and Niepce, who found a way to fix an image on a metal plate. So he found a kind of paper that would be submerged in a solution of table salt and silver nitrate without disintegrating. The result of combining these two chemicals would make silver nitrate. If you remember from Johann Schultz, that was the chemical compound that reacted to light. So what he would do, he would first soak in a solution of table salt, let it dry, and then he would paint the solution of silver nitrate on top of that. The first images that he produced were of leaves and lace, which he placed on a sheet of a light-sensitive paper, put a glass over that sheet, and exposed it to sun. Now, he called these images photogenic drawings. Is there anything that these images or the process remind you of? It is kind of the same process, similar to heliographs by Niepce. Niepce would put objects on top of asphalt-coated metal plate, expose them to sun, and Fox Talbot did the same thing. Place the objects on top of the paper that was light sensitive, expose them to light, and then wash away the part of silver salt that didn't react to light. And he would get these photogenic drawings of primarily plants and lace. And finally, he said, oh, let me just put this sensitized paper in the back of the camera obscura and expose it to light. Now, what he did, he would make a negative image. That's what he would get. And then when he would press the negative image and place it on top of another sheet of sensitized paper, put the glass over and expose it to light, he would actually get a positive image. Now, this photograph here from 1835 is the earliest surviving paper negative. Again, this is the negative image that he directly got from camera obscura, and this is a positive print that he made from negative here. And this is the original drawing with the original image that Fox Talbot did. Now, in 1839, Few months after Daguerre announced Daguerreotype, Fox Talbot announced his process to the British Academy of Scientists as Calotype. And it was Daguerre's announcement that prompted Fox Talbot to make his own experiments public, even though he worked on them and he knew of the process for a while. However, because he was not commercially driven like Daguerre, it was not his primary goal to announce the process. He was pretty much just doing it for himself. And now Calotype is a silver nitrate coated paper exposed in the back of a camera obscura. It produced a negative image, negative placed in contact with another piece of sensitive paper to produce a positive image. So we can see it here, right? So this was a negative image got from camera obscura, and then this is one of many positive images that you can make from that negative image. Now, Fox Talbot discovered the main elements of modern photography, which is a negative image capable of making multiple positive photographic prints. Now, the problem was that fibers in the paper reduced the sharpness and the quality of the print. Now, unlike the daguerreotype, which we said was extremely, extremely sharp, it was that silver-coated metal plate. It was super smooth, super shiny, able of capturing every single detail. The fiber in the paper didn't really allow that. So that was one of the drawbacks. So it was a reproducible process. However, the quality and the sharpness was not as great as the daguerreotype. And another drawback is that prints would tend to fade. So you would have to keep them in a darker place. So again, Calotype image is not as sharp as the daguerreotype, but it has a benefit of being reproducible. And these are some of the images that Fox Talbot did around his estate. And these are some of the people. You can see that people were blurry, right? They had to pose for an image because the process was really slow, just like the daguerreotype. So people would really hold this pose for a while. And you can tell that, the head was blurry a little bit. The hair would move probably from the wind. It was very hard to capture that pose. And this is Fox Talbot. Now, again, just to compare, we have two photographic processes that were announced to the world pretty much at the same time in 1839. One was a calotype process developed by Fox Talbot in England, which would result in a negative image that can be reproducible and make a number of positive prints, which was great. However, the quality and the sharpness was not that great. And that's what people were looking for. They were looking for this realistic, hyper-real, sharp image, which was given to them by the daguerreotype. The daguerreotype was super sharp, very detailed, almost looked like reality itself. However, the problem was that it was not reproducible. So thank you for listening to this week's lecture and make sure to follow further instructions on Blackboard.